Bang, bang, bang. Open the gate. The HOA reserved your cabin for 100 guests today. Behind her stood SUVs honking like a parade. I locked the gate. Click. Karen turned red. Everyone pulled out phones. Police being called or Karen about to be humiliated. Comment your state plus hashtag lock the gate. Then subscribe to La HOA Karen Stories 88. The morning started like any other Saturday at my cabin retreat. I was 50 yards into my woodworking when the sound of car doors slamming broke the peaceful silence of Pine Ridge. Through my workshop window, I watched a parade of SUVs line up outside my property like some kind of political rally. At the front, clipboard in hand, stood a woman I recognized from the HOA newsletters but had never formally met. Her name was Karen Whitmore, and she looked like she meant business, the kind of business that involved other people's property becoming her personal playground. I set down my chisel and walked toward the front gate, coffee mug in hand, wondering what fresh hell the Homeowners Association had cooked up this time. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd bought this cabin specifically to escape the very drama now parking itself on my doorstep. Karen approached my gate with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire 46 years. Her clipboard was thick with papers, and behind her at least 30 people were climbing out of vehicles, carrying coolers, folding chairs, and what appeared to be a sound system. She cleared her throat dramatically and began reading from her clipboard like she was delivering a court order. According to Karen, the HOA had reserved my cabin and surrounding property for their annual community picnic, expecting over 100 attendees by noon. She cited Rule 13 of the community guidelines, something about shared recreational spaces and advanced notification procedures. I listened patiently, sipping my coffee and watching more cars arrive, their occupants already scouting my property like they owned it. The whole scene felt surreal, like watching someone plan a wedding in your living room without asking permission first. Here's the thing about power-hungry HOA board members, and trust me, I've dealt with my share since moving to Pine Ridge 5 years ago. They operate under the assumption that community guidelines trump actual property law, that their little fiefdom somehow supersedes the legal documents that define ownership boundaries. Karen was clearly one of these clipboard warriors, the type who'd probably failed at middle management in the corporate world and now compensated by micromanaging neighborhood flowerbed heights and mailbox colors. What she didn't know, and what I was about to teach her, was that my property had been legally exempt from HOA jurisdiction since 2020, thanks to a boundary amendment I'd fought tooth and nail to secure after my wife passed. That amendment wasn't just paperwork to me. It represented my right to grieve and heal in peace without some suburban dictator deciding how I should use my own land. I walked calmly to my gate, pulled out my keys, and locked it with a satisfying click that echoed across the suddenly quiet parking area. The sound cut through Karen's recitation like a gavel ending a court session. Her mouth fell open mid-sentence, and I could see the gears turning in her head as she processed what had just happened. Behind her, the crowd began murmuring, phones appearing in hands like modern-day torches and pitchforks. I pulled out my own phone and started recording, making sure to capture Karen's face as reality began to dawn on her. This wasn't going to be the smooth community event she'd orchestrated in her mind. This was about to become a very public lesson in property rights and the limits of HOA authority. The best part, I had all the legal documentation to back up every move I was making. Karen's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something that looked suspiciously like panic. She demanded I open the gate immediately, threatening to call the sheriff and citing various HOA penalties that she clearly believed carried the weight of federal law. I simply smiled and told her to make that call, pulling out my own phone to dial Deputy Cole Ramirez, a practical man who dealt with HOA disputes before and understood the difference between community guidelines and actual legal authority. While we waited for law enforcement to arrive, I took the opportunity to educate Karen and her increasingly restless crowd about the 2020 boundary amendment that had legally removed my property from HOA jurisdiction. I showed them the surveyor's markers, the recorded documents, and the official county filing that made my cabin about as much their business as the moon. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably, some already heading back to their cars as they realized they'd been fed bad information. When Deputy Ramirez arrived 20 minutes later, the whole situation transformed from neighborhood drama to legal education seminar. He examined my deed, the 2020 amendment, and the survey markers with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen this movie before. In front of 30 witnesses with recording phones, he confirmed what I'd been trying to tell Karen since she'd arrived. My property was legally exempt from HOA authority, and any attempt to use it without permission constituted trespassing. The deputy's words carried the weight that Karen's clipboard never could, and I watched her face crumble as her grand community event collapsed in real time. But the real twist came when Evelyn Brooks, a 70-year-old neighbor who'd been quietly watching from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward and loudly declared that she'd tried to warn Karen about this exact issue 3 weeks ago. Apparently, this wasn't Karen's first attempt at creative property management, and the community was getting tired of her overreach. The crowd dispersed like smoke in the wind, SUVs pulling away with the defeated energy of people who'd been promised a party but delivered to a legal lecture instead. Karen stood alone by my gate clipboard, clutched to her chest like a shield that had failed to protect her from reality. Her face had gone from confident authority to confused disbelief, to something approaching genuine panic, as she realized the depth of her legal miscalculation. I almost felt sorry for her in that moment, watching a middle-aged woman grapple with the collapse of her carefully constructed narrative about community leadership and moral authority. Almost, but not quite, because I'd learned long ago that bullies rely on their victims' sympathy to avoid consequences for their actions. Karen had created this mess through arrogance and willful ignorance of basic property law, and now she was going to have to live with the embarrassment of being publicly corrected by actual legal authority. Deputy Ramirez handed me his business card and suggested I document any future incidents involving my property, a polite way of acknowledging that Karen's type rarely accepts defeat gracefully on the first round. He'd clearly dealt with HOA disputes before and understood the psychology of people who mistake community guidelines for constitutional authority. As his patrol car pulled away, I noticed several neighbors lingering across the street, their phones still recording, waiting to see how this drama would conclude. The smart ones had already figured out that Karen's authority was built on quicksand, and were probably wondering what other HOA decisions might be similarly questionable. The loyal ones looked confused and angry, like supporters of a political candidate who just watched their hero get demolished in a debate they'd been promised would be a victory lap. But the most telling moment came when Chad Pennington, Karen's most vocal supporter on social media, approached my gate after the crowd had dispersed and quietly asked if he could see a copy of the 2020 amendment for himself. His tone had shifted from hostile to curious, and I could see the wheels turning as he processed the gap between Karen's confident assertions and the legal reality Deputy Ramirez had just confirmed. I showed him the documents, explained the amendment process, and watched his face change as he realized he'd been defending a position based on incomplete information and social pressure rather than facts. Chad's conversion from Karen's supporter to neutral observer happened in real time, and I knew that Karen's support network was about to get significantly smaller as word spread about what had really transpired at my gate. The afternoon settled into an uneasy quiet that felt like the calm before a storm, and I spent the rest of the day reinforcing my security systems and reviewing my legal documentation. Karen had retreated, but she hadn't surrendered, and I could feel the tension building for whatever move she'd make next. People like Karen don't accept public humiliation gracefully, especially when their entire identity is built around being the neighborhood authority figure who keeps everyone else in line. She'd invested too much of her ego in this fight to walk away quietly, and I knew that the legal defeat would only make her more desperate and potentially more dangerous. The game had changed from property dispute to personal vendetta, and I needed to be ready for whatever creative interpretation of community authority Karen would invent to save face and maintain her illusion of power. Monday morning brought 3 official-looking envelopes taped to my gate like some kind of bureaucratic ransom note. Karen had apparently spent her Sunday crafting a paper trail of violations, fines, and demands that read like the fever dream of someone who'd watched too many legal dramas. The first letter cited me for unauthorized gate modifications, as if locking my own property was somehow a community violation. The second imposed a $200 fine for denying community access to designated recreational space, conveniently ignoring the fact that my cabin had never been designated as anything other than private property. The third was a demand letter threatening legal action if I didn't immediately provide HOA access and remove all barriers to community use of my facilities. I read through each document, carefully scanning every line for legal basis, finding nothing but wishful thinking and manufactured authority. Rather than getting angry, I did what any sensible property owner should do when faced with fraudulent paperwork. I documented everything. I scanned each letter in high-resolution saved digital copies to multiple locations and then did something that felt incredibly therapeutic. I built a fire in my living room fireplace and fed Karen's violations to the flames one page at a time. There's something deeply satisfying about watching baseless threats turn to ash and smoke, especially when you know you have the legal high ground. The warmth from that fire felt like justice, and I made sure to record the whole process for my own records. After all, if Karen wanted to play documentation games, I was prepared to play them better. The ashes of her violations would make excellent fertilizer for my garden, probably the most productive use they'd ever serve. My response came in the form of a carefully crafted email to the entire HOA board with copies to their legal counsel and the county recorder's office. I attached my property deed, the 2020 boundary amendment, the original survey, and photos of the surveyor's markers that clearly established my property boundaries. The email was polite but crystal clear. Any further attempts to assert HOA authority over my exempt property would be documented as harassment and forwarded to appropriate legal authorities. I included specific statutory references about property rights and trespassing laws, making it clear that I wasn't some confused homeowner who could be bullied with official-looking letterhead. The response came within 4 hours from HOA Secretary Miles Bradford, a CPA who apparently understood legal liability better than Karen did. His email was brief and apologetic, confirming my property's exempt status and requesting that all future correspondence be directed through proper legal channels. But Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat, and her next move showed just how far she was willing to go to save face. Tuesday evening, I discovered a Facebook post in the Pine Ridge community group announcing a rescheduled community picnic to be held at my cabin the following weekend. The post included detailed directions to my property, promised food trucks and live music, and encouraged residents to bring their families for a day of fun at our wonderful community recreational facility. The audacity was breathtaking, but the stupidity was even more impressive. Karen had essentially created a public record of her intent to trespass, complete with timestamps and witnesses. I screenshot the entire post, including the 43 likes and 12 comments from neighbors who were apparently excited about their upcoming illegal gathering. Then I crafted a public response that included photos of my property boundary markers, links to the county records showing my exempt status, and a gentle reminder that trespassing is a criminal offense regardless of how it's advertised on social media. The post disappeared within an hour, but the damage was done. Screenshots live forever on the internet, and several neighbors had already shared the correction to their own social media accounts. Chad Pennington, a 36-year-old neighbor who'd been one of Karen's most vocal supporters, sent me a private message apologizing for liking the post and admitting he'd never actually read the HOA documents. He'd been defending. It was a small victory, but it revealed something important about Karen's support base. It was built on assumptions and social pressure rather than actual knowledge or legal authority. The tide was turning, and I could feel the community starting to see through Karen's manufactured authority to the petty tyrant underneath. But I also knew that cornered animals often fight the hardest, and Karen was about to prove just how dangerous a clipboard warrior could become when their kingdom started crumbling. What really struck me during this whole paper war was how it reflected the larger issues we're all dealing with these days. Just like how politicians promise simple solutions to complex problems like immigration reform or Middle East conflicts, Karen was offering the fantasy of community harmony through authoritarian control. She wanted neighbors to believe that surrendering individual property rights would somehow create a utopian subdivision where everyone shared resources and no one ever disagreed. It's the same magical thinking that drives people to believe that government agencies can solve housing costs, inflation, and healthcare with the right set of regulations. The reality is messier and requires respecting individual rights while building genuine community relationships, not manufacturing fake authority through paperwork and social pressure. My property line wasn't just about real estate. It was about the principle that your rights don't end where someone else's wishes begin. The motion sensors around my property lit up like a Christmas tree at 12:42 a.m. on Thursday, sending alerts straight to my phone and jolting me out of deep sleep. Through my bedroom window, I could see multiple vehicles creeping up my gravel drive with their headlights off, moving like some kind of suburban special forces operation. 4 figures emerged from a black SUV, working quickly and quietly to unload what appeared to be a large canopy folding tables and chairs. They were setting up for Karen's canceled community event anyway, apparently betting that a fait accompli in the middle of the night would be harder to undo than daylight trespassing. I grabbed my robe, slipped on boots, and activated every security camera on my property before stepping outside. The irony wasn't lost on me that Karen's crew had chosen to execute their operation during the exact hours when property defense laws are most robust, and law enforcement takes trespassing most seriously. I flipped on every floodlight surrounding my cabin, turning night into day and catching the trespassers in the middle of their setup like deer in headlights. The lead figure, a man I didn't recognize carrying Karen's infamous clipboard, froze mid-hammer swing as the lights revealed their midnight operation in all its illegal glory. I walked calmly to my gate, phone in hand, live streaming everything to my cloud storage, while simultaneously dialing the sheriff's non-emergency line. The conversation was brief, and professional private property confirmed trespassers' request for immediate response. I gave them exactly 20 seconds to pack up and leave before this became a criminal matter instead of a civil dispute. The clipboard carrier tried to argue that Karen had given them permission, apparently not understanding that Karen had about as much authority to permit activity on my property as she did to authorize NASA launches from my backyard. The beauty of having everything documented became crystal clear as I watched 4 grown adults scramble to dismantle their midnight festival setup while being recorded in high definition. They loaded tables and chairs with the desperate efficiency of bank robbers, hearing sirens, their community picnic dreams evaporating under the harsh reality of actual law enforcement involvement. The whole scene would have been hilarious if it weren't so pathetic suburban parents sneaking around like teenagers risking criminal records for a HOA board member who'd clearly lost touch with reality. But the real shock came 30 seconds after they drove away when my phone buzzed with an anonymous text message. "Don't forget, you still have to live here." The message sent chills down my spine and transformed what had been a property dispute into something much more personal and potentially dangerous. That text message changed everything and forced me to escalate my response from defensive to proactive. I immediately forwarded the threatening message to Deputy Ramirez, along with the complete video documentation of the midnight trespassing incident. I also compiled everything into a comprehensive harassment complaint that I sent directly to the HOA's legal counsel and insurance carrier, making it clear that this had moved beyond simple community disagreements into potential criminal territory. The paper trail was becoming a fortress of legal protection, and I wanted every authority figure in the county to understand that Karen's crusade was spiraling out of control. Most importantly, I wanted a clear public record that I'd attempted to resolve this through proper channels before being forced to take more serious defensive measures. The days of treating this as neighborhood drama were officially over, and I needed everyone involved to understand the legal and financial risks they were creating. The response to my harassment complaint came faster than I'd expected, with HOA Board Chairman Miles Bradford calling me personally at 8 a.m. Friday morning. His voice carried the strained tone of someone who'd spent the night talking to lawyers and insurance agents, trying to calculate the potential liability of Karen's escalating campaign. He assured me that an emergency board meeting would be scheduled for the following Tuesday, that all of my concerns would be addressed formally, and that the HOA would take appropriate action to prevent further incidents. For the first time since this whole mess started, I heard genuine authority in someone's voice, rather than the manufactured bluster that Karen had been wielding like a weapon. The tide was turning, but I knew that cornered bullies often fight hardest when they sense their power slipping away, and Karen still had one more card to play. What troubled me most about the midnight incident wasn't just the trespassing, but what it revealed about the mindset driving Karen's behavior. We're living in an era where people seem to believe that passionate conviction justifies ignoring inconvenient laws and boundaries, whether it's protesters blocking highways, activists occupying private businesses, or neighbors deciding that community needs override individual property rights. It's the same mentality that drives people to believe that housing shortages justify seizing private property for public use, or that immigration concerns justify ignoring due process protections. Karen had convinced herself and her followers that their vision of community harmony was so important that my legal property rights were just obstacles to be overcome through persistence and social pressure. The midnight operation wasn't just trespassing. It was a preview of what happens when people decide that their good intentions justify steamrolling over anyone who stands in their way. Tuesday evening's emergency HOA board meeting packed the community center like a small-town murder trial, with neighbors filling every chair and lining the walls to witness what everyone knew would be a decisive confrontation. I arrived early and chose a seat in the back corner where I could observe the entire room while keeping my exit clear, a habit developed from too many years dealing with unpredictable people in high-stress situations. Karen entered 15 minutes late, her face flushed and her clipboard thicker than ever, followed by a small entourage of supporters who looked increasingly uncomfortable as they noticed the hostile energy in the room. The formal agenda listed my complaint as item number 4, but everyone understood that items 1 through 3 were just procedural theater before the main event. Chairman Miles Bradford called the meeting to order with the nervous efficiency of someone who'd spent the weekend consulting lawyers and praying his HOA's insurance would cover whatever legal mess Karen had created. The presentation of evidence felt like watching a prosecutor lay out a federal case complete with projected images and documented timelines that left no room for interpretation or spin. My property deed filled the projector screen, followed by the 2020 boundary amendment, the official survey markers and photographs proving my legal exemption from HOA authority. Miles methodically walked through each document while the room sat in uncomfortable silence, the weight of actual legal reality settling over Karen's supporters like a cold fog. When he finished with the documentation, he opened the floor for community input, and that's when the meeting transformed from procedural formality into public reckoning. Evelyn Brooks, the 70-year-old neighbor who'd become my unlikely ally, stood up and delivered a speech that cut through the tension like a sharp blade through silk. Evelyn's testimony revealed the pattern of behavior that had brought us to this moment, describing 3 years of escalating overreach that had affected dozens of neighbors beyond my property dispute. She detailed how Karen had fined her for a flower bed that allegedly violated community aesthetics standards, then tried to force the removal of a memorial garden dedicated to her late husband, because it wasn't pre-approved by the architectural committee. The room erupted in murmurs as other neighbors began nodding and whispering about their own encounters with Karen's authoritarian approach to community management. Chad Pennington raised his hand and apologized publicly for supporting social media posts he now realized were based on false information, admitting that he'd been manipulated by Karen's presentation of herself as a community defender rather than investigating the actual facts. The mood in the room shifted perceptibly as neighbors began connecting their individual frustrations into a pattern of systematic abuse of authority. Karen's defense of her actions revealed the full extent of her delusion and sense of entitlement, confirming everything I'd suspected about her motivation and mental state. She stood before the room and delivered an impassioned speech about community wellness, claiming that my property represented a valuable resource that was being selfishly withheld from families who deserved access to recreational space. Her voice rose as she painted herself as a champion of community values against the forces of individualistic selfishness, completely ignoring the legal reality that my property had never been designated as community space. The performance might have been compelling if it weren't so obviously disconnected from basic concepts of property law and personal rights. She actually said with a straight face that community wellness trumped individual property rights and that good neighbors should willingly sacrifice their legal protections for the greater good of suburban harmony. The legal consultation came via speakerphone from Lila Harper, the HOA's retained attorney who cut through Karen's emotional appeals with the cold precision of someone who understood liability and legal exposure. Harper explained that the evidence presented constituted clear harassment under state law, that the HOA could face significant financial penalties if Karen's behavior continued, and that the board had both the authority and responsibility to take immediate corrective action. She recommended an immediate suspension of Karen's event planning authority, a formal censure on her HOA record, and a written directive prohibiting any further contact or claims regarding my property. The legal advice carried the weight of potential lawsuits and insurance claims, transforming the discussion from community politics to organizational survival. When Harper finished her presentation, the room fell silent except for the sound of Karen's heavy breathing and the scraping of chairs as her remaining supporters edged away from her. The formal vote happened with the swift efficiency of a board that had finally understood the legal and financial stakes of Karen's crusade, with 4 members voting to strip her of all event planning authority and issue a formal, written censure that would become part of the permanent HOA record. Only Karen voted against the motion, her voice shaking with rage as she accused the board of betraying community values and enabling selfish individualism that would destroy neighborhood cooperation. Her meltdown was complete and public, with accusations flying about board corruption, legal conspiracies, and personal vendettas that revealed the depth of her disconnection from reality. As she stormed toward the exit, she turned back to deliver one final threat about taking her case to the county commissioners and exposing the whole community's failure to prioritize collective good over individual greed. The irony was perfect. A woman who'd spent months violating my individual rights was now claiming that her individual rights were being violated by collective action against her behavior. But Karen's public humiliation was just the beginning of her downfall, and I could see in her eyes that she had no intention of accepting defeat gracefully or respecting the board's authority over her actions. The real question wasn't whether she'd been stopped, but how far she'd go to save face and maintain her delusion of community leadership. As I left that meeting, I knew the most dangerous phase of this conflict was just beginning, because nothing is more unpredictable than a petty tyrant who's been publicly stripped of their power and has nothing left to lose. The votes had been counted, the censure had been issued, but Karen's war against my property rights was far from over, and her next move would prove just how far a suburban dictator would go to avoid admitting she'd been wrong from the very beginning. Sunday morning brought Karen's final gambit, and it was even more desperate and delusional than I'd anticipated after watching her public meltdown at the board meeting. She arrived at 9 a.m. with 2 men carrying professional-grade video equipment, a banner reading "Bring Back Our Community Spaces," and the unshakable conviction that public opinion could somehow override legal property rights. They set up their operation on the public road adjacent to my property line, technically legal, but obviously designed to create content that would paint me as the villain in Karen's manufactured documentary about community access and suburban selfishness. I watched from my kitchen window as she positioned herself in front of my gate like a civil rights activist, staging a protest, completely oblivious to the fact that she was actually the oppressor in this scenario, not the victim fighting against injustice. Karen's documentary project revealed the full extent of her delusion and her complete inability to accept the legal reality that had been explained to her multiple times by multiple authorities. She spoke earnestly into the camera about property rights versus community needs, individual selfishness versus collective welfare, and the importance of shared resources in building strong neighborhoods. Her narrative was compelling in the way that all good propaganda is compelling, mixing legitimate concerns about community building with completely false claims about my property's legal status and history. She painted herself as a reasonable advocate for family recreation who'd been stonewalled by a selfish neighbor who refused to share space that rightfully belonged to the entire community. The performance was Academy Award worthy in its sincerity and complete disconnection from factual reality. My response was swift, decisive, and perfectly legal under county noise ordinance regulations that I'd researched carefully after the midnight trespassing incident. I activated the emergency warning siren that I'd installed after consulting with my security company, a device designed to alert authorities and neighbors to property threats or intrusions. The siren's piercing wail cut through Karen's documentary soundtrack like a knife, making professional audio recording impossible, while staying within legal decibel limits for daytime property protection. The look on Karen's face as her carefully planned media event dissolved into cacophony was worth every penny I'd spent on security upgrades, and the footage of her trying to deliver earnest talking points while air raid sirens blared in the background would have been hilarious if posted to social media. The real twist came when Chairman Miles Bradford arrived with an official HOA resolution that had been drafted overnight by their legal counsel, formally prohibiting any HOA member from making public claims about my property or using it in any promotional materials, social media posts, or community events. The resolution carried the full weight of the HOA's corporate authority and included specific penalties for violations, including potential expulsion from the community and personal liability for any legal costs incurred by continued harassment. Miles read the resolution aloud while Karen's cameras rolled, creating an official record that would make any future claims about community access legally actionable as defamation. The document was comprehensive, professionally drafted, and designed to shut down Karen's campaign permanently while protecting the HOA from further liability exposure. But the most satisfying moment came when Evelyn Brooks approached my gate and delivered an impromptu speech that redefined community values in terms that actually made sense to rational people. She spoke directly into Karen's camera about respect for boundaries, legal property rights, and the difference between genuine community building and authoritarian control disguised as collective welfare. Her words carried the moral authority of someone who'd lived through actual community challenges and understood that sustainable neighborhoods are built on mutual respect rather than forced sharing and manufactured consensus. Evelyn's presence transformed Karen's narrative from noble community advocate versus selfish individualist into wise elder versus delusional bully, and I could see Karen's remaining support evaporating in real time as neighbors chose sides based on actual principles rather than emotional manipulation. The final chapter of Karen's documentary disaster came when Chad Pennington volunteered to post a comprehensive correction and apology to the community social media group, admitting that he'd been misled about my property, legal status, and Karen's authority to make claims about community access. His post included links to the county records, photos of my property boundaries, and a detailed timeline of Karen's escalating harassment campaign that culminated in the midnight trespassing incident and threatening messages. The correction was pinned to the top of the group page for 7 days, ensuring that every community member would see the factual record rather than Karen's fictional narrative. Chad's public reversal represented the collapse of Karen's social media support network and the community's final rejection of her authoritarian approach to neighborhood management. As I locked my gate one final time and watched Karen pack up her failed documentary equipment, I couldn't help but reflect on what this whole experience revealed about the nature of power, authority, and community in modern America. Karen's crusade represented everything wrong with our current political culture: the belief that passionate conviction justifies ignoring inconvenient laws, that community needs can override individual rights, and that social pressure can substitute for legal authority. Her downfall was a reminder that real communities are built on respect for boundaries, rather than the elimination of boundaries, on voluntary cooperation, rather than forced compliance, and on understanding that individual rights actually strengthen collective welfare rather than threatening it. The clipboard might have been thick, but the amendment papers were thicker, and in the end, legal reality trumped social media fantasy, just like it should in any functioning society. The warning sirens that ended Karen's documentary weren't just about stopping her harassment campaign. They were about defending a principle that extends far beyond property lines to the fundamental question of how free people should live together. Whether we're talking about immigration policies that balance compassion with law enforcement Middle East, conflicts that require respecting sovereign boundaries, or neighborhood disputes that pit individual rights against collective demands, the same principles apply. Sustainable solutions require respecting legal frameworks, understanding that good intentions don't justify bad methods, and recognizing that real community is built through voluntary cooperation rather than authoritarian force. Karen's gate-crashing crusade was a perfect microcosm of every political movement that promises harmony through the elimination of boundaries and individual protections. The truth is, every boundary we defend makes room for genuine relationship to grow. Every right we protect creates space for real community to flourish. And every time we choose legal process over emotional manipulation, we build the kind of society where neighbors can actually trust each other instead of constantly watching their backs. That's what makes stories like this worth telling, and it's why HOA Karen Stories 88 exists to document these moments when ordinary people defend extraordinary principles. If you've made it this far, you understand that these aren't just property disputes or neighborhood drama, they're lessons about how freedom actually works in the real world. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in boundaries that protect, rather than divide like this video if you've ever had to defend your own space against entitled bullies. And check out our previous episodes where we've covered everything from HOA presidents who tried to seize private driveways to community board members who declared war on holiday decorations. Each story is different, but the principle is always the same. Your rights don't end where someone else's wishes begin, and defending that truth is what keeps communities free.